Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Today, we're unpacking the absolute foundation of modern digital security. Whether you're building secure systems, studying cybersecurity, or honestly, just wondering how your private data actually stays private on the internet, you have to understand the critical difference between symmetric and asymmetric encryption. One is lightning fast, and the other is brilliantly secure. But if you try to make one do the other's job, well, your entire system just falls apart.
So let's kick things off with a massive digital dilemma. How do you actually share a secret? Imagine you need to send a super sensitive message to a friend. You could just lock it in a box and mail it over, but how's your friend going to unlock it? If you send the key right alongside the locked box, any attacker sitting in the middle can just grab the key, open the box, and read your message. It completely defeats the purpose of the lock in the first place.
Which brings us to Section 1, the key distribution problem. To solve this problem over the public internet, we're basically left with two fundamental approaches. Option A uses a single key. Now, it's incredibly fast to lock and unlock, but we run headfirst into that massive hurdle of how to securely share that single key. Option B, on the other hand, gives us two completely different keys, one strictly for locking and one strictly for unlocking. This allows for incredibly secure sharing, but the complex mechanics behind it make the actual locking and unlocking process painfully slow.
Let's dive a bit deeper into this with Section 2, Symmetric Encryption Explained. What's really fascinating about symmetric encryption is its absolute simplicity. It simply means that both parties, let's call them Alice and Bob, must possess the exact same key. Alice uses key A to scramble her plaintext message, and Bob uses that exact same key A to unscramble it. Because they're using the same key, the math under the hood is pretty straightforward. It's basically just rapid substitution and permutation.
And the advantages here are massive. Because the math is relatively simple, symmetric encryption is incredibly fast. We're talking gigabytes per second on modern hardware. It uses very little CPU and memory, which makes it perfect for encrypting huge chunks of data, like an entire hard drive or a massive database. And please don't mistake simple for weak. Modern symmetric algorithms like AES-256 are virtually unbreakable. Seriously, it would take our best current computers billions of years just to brute force a single AES-256 key.
But here is the catch. The symmetric algorithm itself is perfectly secure, sure, but we're right back to our original dilemma. The fatal flaw is getting that key to Bob in the first place. Both parties need it, but if you transmit that key over a network, an attacker can just intercept it. And if the key gets compromised, well, every single piece of encrypted data goes down with it.
To fix this, we move to Section 3, Asymmetric Encryption Explained.
This is where things get genuinely magical. Instead of one key, asymmetric encryption generates a matched pair of two different keys. First, you have a public key, and you can share this with absolutely anyone. You literally want people to have it, but it's only used to encrypt data. Second, you have a private key which you must fiercely protect. You never share this with anyone because it's used exclusively to decrypt data. The pure genius here is the asymmetry. Whatever the public key locks, only the private key can unlock.
So let's walk through how this actually works for Alice and Bob. Step 1, Alice generates her key pair. Step 2, she openly publishes her public key. She can slap it on her website, tweet it out, whatever. Bob grabs it. Step 3, Bob uses Alice's public key to encrypt a secret message for her. And here's the crazy part. At this point, not even Bob can decrypt what he just wrote. Finally, Step 4, Bob sends the encrypted message over to Alice, and she uses her closely guarded private key to decrypt it. Even if a hacker intercepts the message and has Alice's public key, they get absolutely nothing. Boom. Key distribution problem solved.
But of course, there's a trade-off. That mathematical magic I mentioned, algorithms like RSA are doing some incredibly heavy lifting behind the scenes, like factoring massive prime numbers. Because it's so computationally intense, asymmetric encryption is roughly 50,000 times slower than symmetric encryption.
And real-world benchmarks really put that into perspective. If you use a symmetric algorithm like AES-256, encrypting a 1 GB file takes about 2 seconds. Fast, right? But if you try to use an asymmetric algorithm like RSA-2048 on that exact same file, it crawls at kilobytes per second. You'd be waiting over 16 minutes. So for bulk data, asymmetric encryption is completely impractical. It's just way too slow.
So what's the fix? Let's check out Section 4, the hybrid solution.
Okay, we've got one system that's blazing fast but terrible at sharing keys, and another that shares keys flawlessly but moves like molasses. The solution? We literally mash them together into hybrid encryption. This is the climax of this explainer, because this is how modern security actually works. including the HTTPS protocol that's securing your web browser right now. Step 1. Your browser and the website use that slow, asymmetric math just to securely agree on a brand new, random symmetric key. Once they've swapped that key safely, they immediately ditch the asymmetric stuff. Step 2. They use that newly shared symmetric key to encrypt all the actual website data flowing back and forth at gigabytes per second. You get the ultra-secure key distribution plus the blazing speed. Best of both worlds.
And modern systems actually take this a step further using a concept called forward secrecy, often using a really clever mathematical trick called Diffie-Hellman. Instead of using the same symmetric key over and over, systems generate a temporary, ephemeral session key for every single connection. Basically, a burn-after-reading key. Why does that matter? Because even if a server's master private key gets hacked years from now, the attacker can't go back and decrypt your old traffic. Those ephemeral keys were securely deleted the second you closed your browser.
All right, let's wrap things up with Section 5, Real-World Applications and Mistakes.
The absolute core rule for any security architect is knowing exactly when to use which tool. You want to use asymmetric encryption for key exchange, digital signatures, proving someone actually signed a file, and authentication. Then you use symmetric encryption for the heavy lifting, bulk data, encrypting files on a local hard drive, and protecting those massive databases. Now, one of the most dangerous yet totally common mistakes we see developers make is hard-coding keys directly into their source code. Usually, it's just out of pure convenience, but think about it. Anyone with access to that code, anyone who decompiles the app, or anyone scraping through version control like GitHub can just read your key in plain text. If an attacker grabs it, all your fancy symmetric encryption is instantly worthless. So please, always use a dedicated key management system. Hard-coding isn't the only trap, though. Other major failures include trying to use asymmetric encryption for bulk data, which will completely tank your system's performance. Failing to regularly rotate symmetric keys is another bad one. If a key is finally cracked, a ton of historical data gets exposed. Using weak key sizes is a huge red flag too. 1024-bit RSA is considered broken today, so you really need to be using at least 2048-bit, or switching over to elliptic curve cryptography. And lastly, encrypting without digital signatures gives you privacy, sure, but no proof of who actually sent the message, which completely opens the door for tampering. So, to finish up, is your data actually safe? Well, while AES symmetric encryption is considered highly resistant to future threats, the incredibly complex math underlying our current asymmetric systems is uniquely vulnerable to quantum computing. Experts estimate that within the next 20 to 30 years, quantum computers could solve these math problems in a fraction of the time, effectively shattering the key exchanges that protect the internet today. The race for post-quantum cryptography is already fully underway. The real question is, will your systems be ready to adapt when the time comes?
So you download a file from the internet. Maybe it's a critical software update or, a highly sensitive document. How do you actually know, without a shadow of a doubt, that it hasn't been secretly tampered with by an attacker? Or let's bring it right into your inbox. You get this urgent email. It claims to be from your boss, and they're asking for a wire transfer. The stakes are definitely high. But how do you know it's really them and not just some incredibly clever forgery? And think about something like Bitcoin. You're sending funds out into the void of the internet. How on earth can you be absolutely sure those transaction details haven't been intercepted and completely changed in transit? Well, welcome to this explainer. Today, we are going to answer those exact questions by diving into hashing and digital signatures. Seriously, these things are like the invisible cryptographic fingerprints that secure practically our entire digital lives. Here is a quick look at our agenda for today. We're going to cover the cryptographic fingerprint, why hashing is strictly a one-way street, collisions and broken hashes, how digital signatures actually work, and finally, some real-world security applications. All right, let's jump right into part 1, the cryptographic fingerprint. To really wrap our heads around digital security, we first have to understand the hash function. Basically, it's a mathematical algorithm that takes literally any input and spits out a fixed-length output. It's exactly like a human fingerprint. I mean, whether you're feeding it a tiny 1-byte text file or a massive gigabytes of data, the output, the hash, is always going to be this unique, fixed-size string of characters. Now, what's really fascinating here is a core feature called the avalanche effect. Let's say you take a simple phrase like, "Hello world," and generate a hash. You'll get a very specific string. But if you make just one tiny change, say flipping a single bit, or even just changing a capital H to a lowercase h, boom, the entire resulting hash completely changes. It snowballs into a drastically different output. This extreme sensitivity is absolutely crucial because it makes it instantly obvious if a file has been messed with. Now, here is a really critical point: the difference between hashing and encryption. People mix these up all the time. Hashing is entirely one way. It doesn't actually hide the data. It just proves its integrity. You cannot reverse a hash to get the original data back. Encryption, on the other hand, is a two-way street. It's specifically designed to hide data. You lock it with a key, and then later you're meant to reverse it or unlock it with a key. Moving on to part 2, why hashing is one way and the math behind it. Think of hashing like writing a secret message on a piece of paper and then throwing it into a fire and burning it to ash. You've basically performed an operation where the original structure is permanently destroyed and compressed. You obviously can't reconstruct that piece of paper or read the message from a pile of ash, right? It's the same thing digitally. When a massive file is crushed down into a tiny 256-bit hash, that original information is fundamentally gone. Now you might be thinking, okay, but what if I just use a super powerful computer to guess every possible input until the output matches? Well, let's look at the actual numbers here. For a standard SHA-256 hash, there are roughly 1.15 times 10 to the power of 77 possible hashes. Just take a second and let that staggeringly massive number sink in. To really put that scale into perspective, even if you had a supercomputer guessing at a blazing rate of 1 billion hashes per second, it wouldn't just take a lifetime. It would take 10 to the 58th power universes worth of time to brute force a secure hash. So yeah, brute forcing a strong hash is, for all practical purposes, mathematically impossible. Which brings us to part 3, collisions and broken hashes, and a fun little thing called the birthday problem. To understand hash collisions, which is when you actually find two different inputs that happen to produce the exact same hash, we have to challenge our intuition with a famous probability puzzle. It's called the birthday problem. Imagine you're standing in a room with just 23 people. What do you think is the probability that two of them share the exact same birthday? The completely wild answer is roughly 50%. I know, it sounds impossibly high for such a small group, but mathematically it works out because we aren't just comparing one person to everyone else. We're comparing every single person to every other person in that room. And this exact same principle applies to hashes. Even with a massive number of possibilities, finding two different inputs that spit out the same hash, which is a collision, happens way faster than we'd expect because we're comparing every generated hash against every other hash. Let's look at a quick algorithm showdown to see how our standard tools hold up against this collision risk. Right now, SHA-256 and SHA-512 are our gold standards. They are highly secure. But algorithms like MD5 and SHA-1, they are officially cryptographically broken. Seriously, Chinese researchers completely broke MD5 by generating easy collisions way back in 2004. And in 2017, Google famously proved SHA-1 was vulnerable when they generated two completely different files that had the exact same hash, meaning they could literally forge security certificates. But here's the truly alarming part of this whole story. Despite being broken for basically 2 decades, MD5 is still out there, just lurking. You'll find it deeply embedded in legacy systems, old databases, older hashing libraries that people just kept around for backward compatibility, and even old network protocols. It is this massive, silent vulnerability for a lot of organizations that just haven't bothered to update their infrastructure. All right, part 4, how digital signatures work to prove where data actually came from. So, a digital signature is really the ultimate solution for authentication. Here is how the signing process actually works in practice. First, you create your document. Second, you hash that document to create its unique fingerprint. Step 3 is where the real magic happens. You encrypt that hash using your own private key. This effectively creates a mathematically unforgeable wax seal. Finally, you just send the original document along with that new encrypted signature. Now, let's see what happens on the receiving end. To verify the signature, the recipient takes the sender's public key to decrypt the signature. This reveals the original hash that the sender made. Next, the recipient runs their own hash on the document they just got. If those two hashes match perfectly, the recipient knows two things with absolute certainty. The document wasn't tampered with, and it absolutely definitely came from the sender. This provides what we call non-repudiation. Basically, the sender cannot later deny that they signed it. Which leads us to our final section, Part 5, Real-World Security Applications. Here is one of the most practical, everyday applications of this: verifying software downloads, like if you're downloading a massive Linux ISO file. It's super simple. First, you download the file. Second, you run a hash function on it yourself using a tool like SHA-256-SUM. Finally, you just compare your output to the official hash posted by the publisher on their website. If those match perfectly, you have an absolute guarantee that no malicious third party intercepted and tampered with your download. And honestly, the applications for this are truly everywhere. These cryptographic fingerprints secure the HTTPS lock icon in your browser using SSL certificates. They enforce Windows code signing so a malicious driver can't just take over your computer. They form the absolute backbone of the Bitcoin blockchain, securing the proof of work and every single transaction. Oh, and they secure your passwords. Modern systems use specialized algorithms like bcrypt or Argon2, and they add what's called a salt, basically a random string of data, to your password before hashing it. This brilliant little addition makes pre-computed hacker tools, like those massive rainbow tables, completely useless. While we have covered a tremendous amount of ground in this explainer, from the basic mathematical avalanche effect all the way to the complex signatures securing global blockchains, I'll leave you with this final, kind of provocative thought. If your entire digital life, your privacy, and your financial security fundamentally depend on these precise cryptographic fingerprints, are you absolutely sure the systems you use, build, or manage aren't still relying on broken wax seals like MD5? It might just be time to take a look under the hood.
Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to completely demystify the invisible architecture of trust that seamlessly secures every single click you make on the internet. You interact with this system thousands of times a day, entirely behind the scenes. So let's just pull back the curtain and see exactly how this all works.
Okay, picture this. You're logging into your bank's website. You look up, and there's that trusty little padlock in the corner of your browser saying secure. But how does your browser actually know this is really your bank? I mean, what's preventing a hacker from sitting right between you and the internet, intercepting your connection with a fake website that looks absolutely identical? Without some ironclad proof of identity, you really have no way of knowing who is on the other end of that screen.
Now you might be thinking, well, I'm using HTTPS. Encryption is going to protect me. But actually, encryption alone doesn't solve this. An attacker can easily encrypt your connection to their fake server. In that scenario, yes, you are connected securely, but you're connected securely to the attacker. You type in your credentials, and they steal them over a perfectly private connection. So encryption only proves your connection is private. To know exactly who you're talking to, you need authentication. A secure connection is just encrypted, but a trusted connection, that's authenticated and encrypted.
To solve that massive authentication problem, we rely on something called public key infrastructure, or PKI. You can't just have a website say, hey, trust me, I'm the bank. Literally anyone could say that. You need proof from a trusted third party. PKI is that system. It introduces a trusted organization known as a certificate authority. Think of them exactly like a government issuing a physical passport. The passport proves who you are, and you trust it because you trust the government that issued it. In the digital world, a certificate authority issues a digital certificate to a server to prove its identity. If your browser trusts the authority, it trusts the website.
Here's our roadmap for today. We're going to cover the architecture of digital trust, the chain of trust, how browsers actually validate these certificates, what happens when certificates go bad, and finally, some real-world PKI failures. Let's jump right into Section 1, the architecture of digital trust.
To really understand this, think about meeting someone who claims to be a lawyer. Without verification, they could just be an imposter trying to take your money, right? But if they show you a valid, up-to-date bar association license, you trust them because you trust the bar association. Well, a digital certificate is just like that license. It's a digital ID packed with crucial metadata: the server's public key, the exact domain name it belongs to, the name of the issuing certificate authority, an expiration date, and absolutely, most importantly, a digital signature from that certificate authority. Your browser checks that signature to make sure the certificate is the real deal.
Moving on to Section 2, the chain of trust.
What's wild here is how trust actually relies on a hierarchy, not just a single signature. See, certificates aren't usually signed directly by the top-level authority. There's a whole chain. At the very top, you have the Root CA. This is the ultimate anchor of trust, and it's pre-installed right in your browser. But if a Root CA's private key ever gets compromised, it's a complete catastrophe. Every single certificate it ever signed would be at risk. So to prevent that, the Root CA is kept completely offline in a highly secure vault. It only ever signs certificates for intermediate CAs.
Those intermediate CAs live online and do the high-volume daily grunt work of signing the leaf certificates, which are the actual certs on the websites you visit. That way, if an intermediate gets hacked, we can just revoke it and replace it while the root stays perfectly safe.
Section 3. How browsers validate certificates. Let's walk through the exact checklist your browser runs through.
Every single time you make an HTTPS connection, your browser runs an incredibly strict validation process in milliseconds. First up, it checks the signature. Was this signed by a trusted CA? Then it checks the validity dates. Are we currently between the valid from and valid until dates? Next, it strictly matches the domain. If you typed example.com, that certificate better explicitly say example.com. Then it builds that chain of trust we just talked about, tracing it all the way back to a root on your machine. And finally, it checks to make sure the certificate hasn't been revoked.
Now, if every single one of those checks passes, you're good. But if even one step fails, your browser immediately throws up one of those giant loud warning screens. You've definitely seen these. If the date is past expiration, you get an expired certificate warning. If the domain doesn't match the URL, which by the way could be a sign of a man-in-the-middle attack, you get a wrong domain warning. And if it's from an unknown entity, you'll see an untrusted CA error. These warnings aren't just annoyances. They are your browser actively keeping you from being scammed.
Section 4. When certificates go bad. Because, well, they don't last forever.
Sometimes a certificate has to be killed off before it naturally expires. Maybe the private key leaked, maybe the domain changed hands, or maybe the CA just messed up. When that happens, we have to check for revocation. Back in the day, browsers used a certificate revocation list, or CRL. This meant your browser had to download massive, painfully slow lists of thousands of revoked serial numbers just to check your one connection. It was slow and definitely not real-time. Enter the modern fix, OCSP, the Online Certificate Status Protocol. Instead of downloading a giant list, your browser just pings the CA with a quick query asking, hey, is this specific certificate still good? And the CA just replies, revoked or valid. Much faster.
But wait, OCSP has a catch. It forces your browser to make an extra network request, slowing things down, and it creates a huge privacy issue because now the certificate authority knows exactly which websites you're visiting. So the ultimate solution we use today is OCSP stapling. With this, the web server itself queries the CA regularly, gets a cryptographically signed response saying, I'm valid, and literally staples that proof directly to the certificate it hands to you. Your browser validates it instantly without ever talking to the CA. It keeps things blazingly fast and totally protects your privacy.
And finally, Section 5, Real-World PKI Failures. Because what happens when the ultimate trust boundary gets breached?
Let's go back to 2011. A major certificate authority called DigiCert was compromised. Remember, this whole system assumes we can implicitly trust the authorities. If one gets hacked, attackers can mint completely valid, trusted certificates for literally any website. In this breach, attackers issued fake certificates for massive giants like Google and Yahoo. And because a real CA signed them, browsers just trusted them. Users had zero way of knowing they were on fake sites. This nightmare scenario lasted for weeks before anyone noticed, enabling massive man-in-the-middle attacks. It was a terrifying reminder that this whole system is only as strong as the authorities running it. To stop that from ever happening again, tech giants pushed out a brilliant defense called certificate transparency. Today, every single issued certificate has to be logged in a public, auditable database, so domain owners can just watch these logs. If a hacker somehow compromises a CA today and secretly mints a fake certificate for Google, Google will instantly see it pop up in the public log and can crush it immediately. It completely eliminates the secrecy from the whole process. So I'll leave you with this. Public key infrastructure is a literal millisecond miracle. It handles billions of secure transactions every single day. But as we've just seen, this massive, invisible architecture is built entirely on the absolute integrity and constant vigilance of just a handful of trusted authorities. As our entire lives become completely dependent on these digital signatures, it really makes you wonder, who is truly watching the authorities? Welcome to The Explainer. Now, I want you to picture something with me for a second. Imagine walking into this sleek, state-of-the-art server room. Right there on the main interface, a giant digital padlock labeled AES-256 is glowing a perfect, reassuring green. Your security team is probably sleeping incredibly soundly tonight, right? Because mathematically speaking, it would take a supercomputer literally billions of years to brute force that kind of defense. But then, the ultimate irony strikes. An alert flashes red. Millions of sensitive customer records just start pouring out of your network. Attackers are actively reading them in plain text. And you know what the craziest part is?
That AES-256 padlock is still glowing green. It's completely untouched. So why does unbreakable encryption still get hacked? Let's really dive into this because it's honestly one of the most fascinating paradoxes in modern cybersecurity. How can data be protected by world-class, mathematically flawless algorithms, but still get stolen and read in a matter of minutes? Well, the answer is that the company didn't leak the algorithm, and the math definitely didn't break. AES-256 worked exactly as advertised. But the system built around that perfect math? Yeah, that's where the true vulnerabilities hide. Today, we're breaking down the harsh reality of how strong encryption actually gets shattered.
Here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at the encryption illusion. Then, math versus human error. Third, common cryptographic traps. Fourth, the real-world fallout. And finally, we'll wrap up with the defense blueprint.
All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, the encryption illusion.
Cryptographic failures currently sit at the number 2 spot on the OWASP Top 10 list of critical web application vulnerabilities. Just think about that. That ranking alone proves just how incredibly rampant this issue is. When data is exposed, whether it's sitting at rest or moving in transit, it's almost never because some elite cybercriminal broke the fundamental laws of mathematics. It's almost always because of widespread, basic human mismanagement.
Which brings us right into Section 2, math versus human error.
We really need to understand the difference between an algorithm failure and an implementation failure. An algorithm failure means the underlying mathematics are just fundamentally broken. A classic example is the legacy MD5 hash algorithm. It suffers from collisions, meaning two totally different inputs can magically generate the exact same output. But here's the kicker. Algorithm failures are actually incredibly rare today. Modern algorithms like AES-256 or SHA-256 are mathematically sound. An implementation failure, on the other hand, represents basically 99% of real-world breaches. It's the equivalent of installing this impenetrable foot-thick bank vault door, but then taping a sticky note to it that says, password 1234. The math is perfect, but the software engineers built a broken system around it. And when an implementation fails, it means the security gap was entirely preventable.
Let's move to Section 3, common cryptographic traps. This is where things get specific.
A really crucial, almost invisible trap is using encryption without authentication. See, basic encryption provides confidentiality. It keeps your secrets hidden, but it does not provide data integrity, which is what guarantees a message hasn't been messed with. Without AAD, that's authenticated encryption with associated data, you are wide open to something called a bit flipping attack. Just imagine you're doing a digital transfer of $100. An attacker intercepts the ciphertext. They can't read it, they don't have the key, but they just flip a few random digital bits. When your server decrypts it, that $100 transfer magically becomes a $1,000 transfer. AAD fixes this by generating an authentication tag. If even a single bit is tampered with, the tag verification fails and the whole decryption instantly aborts.
Then, oh man, we have what might be the single most classic blunder in all of software engineering, hard-coded keys. We've all been there, right? Developers are rushing, they paste a raw key directly into their source code, and they tell themselves, I'll fix this before we go to production. But they forget. That code goes into GitHub, it gets baked into compiled binaries, it sits out there in unencrypted backups. Back in 2013, Dropbox had a massive scare when a master encryption key was found just sitting hard-coded inside their Android app binary. If an attacker finds a string literally labeled secret_key in your code, your impenetrable AES-256 defense instantly drops to 0.
Okay, next we absolutely have to talk about randomness because strong cryptography relies entirely on unpredictability. Standard programming functions like math.random, those are pseudo-random number generators designed for things like video games, not security. They rely on predictable seeds, like the exact system time. If an attacker can guess the exact millisecond your key was generated, they can just recreate your key, no sweat. You must always use cryptographically secure generators, like Python's secrets module, which spin up total, unpredictable chaos.
And that predictability issue, it completely destroys encryption through something called initialization vector, or IV reuse. A lot of encryption modes need a starting random block, that's the IV, to make sure that encrypting the exact same word twice results in totally different ciphertexts. But if a developer reuses the same IV with the same key across different messages, they open the door to an XOR mathematical attack. By simply comparing the two ciphertexts, the encryption mathematically cancels itself out. Boom. The attacker recovers your plain text completely, and they never even needed your key. This exact implementation flaw famously destroyed the early WEP Wi-Fi encryption standard. It made it hackable in minutes.
And then, we have the cryptographic zombies. Despite literally decades of warnings, legacy codebases are just full of deprecated algorithms. DES uses a tiny 56-bit key that modern hardware can brute force while you're eating lunch. MD5 and SHA-1 have proven collision vulnerabilities. Google actually proved this a while back by creating two totally different PDF documents that produce the exact same SHA-1 signature. We also see ECB mode everywhere, which encrypts identical blocks of text into identical blocks of ciphertext. Seriously, if you encrypt an image of a penguin using ECB, the data pattern leaks so badly you can still clearly see the penguin's shape right through the encryption. And finally, you've got to watch out for side-channel vulnerabilities, like timing attacks. If your software validates a password character by character and stops the very millisecond it finds a wrong letter, an attacker can just measure that execution time and figure out your key one character at a time. It's wild.
Moving right along to Section 4, Real-World Fallout. Because these aren't just academic theories. These implementation errors cause devastating mega breaches. In 2012, LinkedIn had 6.5 million passwords stolen because they used simple SHA-1 hashing without a cryptographic salt. That allowed attackers to use pre-computed tables to just instantly reverse them. In 2013, attackers scraped 40 million credit cards from Target. The network transit was encrypted, sure, but the malware simply extracted the active cryptographic keys directly from unencrypted system memory. Strong encryption totally failed key protection. And in 2017, Equifax exposed massive amounts of personal data simply because they lacked comprehensive data-at-rest encryption. Once the perimeter fell, the data was totally naked. Notice a pattern? Not one of these historic hacks happened because an elite hacker broke AES or RSA math. They all happened because of sloppy human implementation.
All right, let's fix this. Section 5, the defense blueprint.
Let's run through the foundational rules for doing cryptography right. Number 1, and please write this down, never invent your own crypto. Just don't. Do not write custom algorithms. Use established, battle-tested libraries like OpenSSL or libsodium. Number 2, enforce modern standards like AES 256 and completely banish things like DES, MD5, and SHA-1 from your environments. Number 3, mandate AEAD modes like AES GCM so you guarantee confidentiality and data integrity at the exact same time. Number 4, fiercely isolate your keys. Get them out of your source code right now and put them into secure cloud vaults or hardware security modules. And number 5, practice defense in depth. Use TLS 1.3 for your data in transit and combine that with strong application layer encryption for your data at rest.
To make this super actionable, here's your time-bound execution plan. This week, run automated scanning tools like TruffleHog or GetSecrets across all your repositories to hunt down any hard-coded keys. This month, audit your legacy codebases. Identify and replace any instances of ECB mode, MD5, or SHA-1. And this quarter, conduct a formal review of your key management architecture to make sure you actually have automated key rotation active. Believe me, attackers are proactively scanning for these exact mistakes right now, so you need to find them first.
Which brings us to our final thought. Cryptography, at its mathematical core, is a solved problem. The algorithms we have today are incredibly powerful and entirely secure. The true vulnerability is basically never the technology itself. It's almost entirely our execution of it.
Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into the high-stakes, strategic decisions behind exactly where and how you should encrypt your data. If you're designing systems right now, you already know that encryption is no longer just some simple compliance checkbox. It's actually a fundamental, complex, architectural puzzle.
Look, you know you're building a system to handle sensitive data. But the real architectural challenge? It's deciding exactly where to apply your defenses. Do you encrypt in the database, in the application layer, just in transit? Or do you, just try to encrypt all three and cross your fingers? Well, as we're going to see, each of these choices carries wildly different costs when it comes to security, performance, and overall system functionality.
So, the big takeaway here, the crucial point, is that we have to move away from this binary mindset of is it encrypted, yes or no. Instead, we need to treat encryption as a game of strategic compromises. You really don't want to just encrypt everything everywhere all at once, because that will literally bring your system to a grinding halt. You want to encrypt strategically. You want to hit the exact point where the data is vulnerable in a way that actually neutralizes your realistic threats.
All right, here is our blueprint for today. We'll start with part 1, the architecture of encryption. Then 2, 3 states of vulnerable data. 3, choosing your encryption layers. 4, the key placement dilemma. And we'll wrap up with 5, the strategic encryption matrix. Let's get into it.
Okay, part 1, the architecture of encryption, where we move beyond that binary thinking. Before you write a single line of code, we really have to evaluate the trade-offs between security, functionality, and performance. And we do that by asking 5 critical questions. First up, what's the actual threat? Are you worried about someone physically stealing a hard drive, or maybe a hacker intercepting data over Wi-Fi? Second, where exactly is the data vulnerable? Third, what specific type of encryption actually stops that threat? Fourth, and honestly, this is where developers get tripped up all the time, what is the cost? Because encryption is slow. It ruins your ability to easily search data, and it adds immense operational complexity. And finally, you have to ask yourself, is the risk versus cost trade-off actually worth it?
Moving on to part 2, 3 states of vulnerable data. Basically, when is your data actually exposed?
So data is vulnerable in 3 very distinct states, and each one requires a completely different approach to protect against eavesdropping, physical theft, or active memory scraping. First, when data is in transit, it's flying across cables and routers, totally exposed to anyone listening on the wire. Then, when it's at rest, it's sitting quietly on a hard drive or in a database backup, just waiting for someone to steal the physical file. And finally, in use is when your application actually opens up the data in memory to read it or compute.
Now check out this number. Trying to encrypt in-use data with methods like homomorphic encryption, which is basically doing math on data while it's still locked up inside a vault, causes a massive 15 to 300% performance penalty. This brilliantly illustrates the cost we were just talking about, and it's exactly why this method is incredibly rare. You really only see this in the most extreme high-threat scenarios, like high-frequency financial trading systems, because that kind of compute overhead is just absolutely punishing for an everyday application.
All right, Section 3, choosing your encryption layers, where we balance security with actual functionality. There is a really stark trade-off here. Application-level encryption gives you pinpoint control, but it completely breaks database functionality. Meanwhile, database encryption is super easy, but it's way less isolated. Think about it. If you encrypt in the application layer before it ever hits the database, your security is incredible. Even if your entire database gets stolen, the attacker just gets pure garbage. But the downside? Your database can no longer easily search or sort that data. Conversely, database layer encryption, like AWS RDS encryption, is an absolute breeze to set up. It's totally transparent to your app. But it really only protects against someone literally walking out of the data center with the physical hard drive.
Now compare all of that complexity to the network layer. Using TLS or HTTPS only has a tiny 1 to 5% performance impact. It is an absolute non-negotiable baseline for everyone. Because it is practically free in terms of processing power, you should absolutely never be transmitting sensitive data without it.
When you stack these solutions together, you're building what we call a defense in-depth strategy. This means if an attacker breaches your network, your application or disk layers are still there acting as a safety net. The real sweet spot for most modern architectures is typically 2 to 3 layers. You always use network layer encryption. You always use disk layer full disk encryption. Then, depending on your specific threat model, you add either database or application layer encryption right in the middle to handle your most deeply sensitive stuff.
Section 4, the key placement dilemma. Because encryption is really only as good as your key management.
Let's break down your architectural choices here. Leaving keys directly in application memory is risky, but it's highly flexible. On the other hand, handing them over to a key management service isolates your risk, but it definitely adds network latency. If you hard-code keys into your application, an app compromise means total data compromise, simple as that. But what if you let the user hold the key, like a password? Well, security goes completely through the roof because you literally don't even have the key to lose. But user experience gets incredibly complicated if they ever forget that password, and we all know they will.
Using a key management service, or KMS, means the application has to make a specific request every single time it needs to decrypt something. This keeps the key perfectly safe, but it does add latency to your overall system. Services like AWS KMS or HashiCorp Vault are pretty much the industry standard right now. Your application sends the encrypted data over to the KMS does the math securely, and then returns the plain text. The actual key never touches your application servers, which is a massive, massive win for isolating your risk.
Now, if you want the absolute ultimate physical security for your keys, a hardware security module is the answer. An HSM is quite literally a tamper-proof physical box that will self-destruct the keys if someone tries to drill into it. It is the gold standard. But at $5,000 to well over $100,000, you really have to justify that price tag against your realistic threats. It's usually reserved for super high-threat environments, like major banks. Finally, Section 5, the Strategic Encryption Matrix. Let's look at how this plays out in real-world scenarios.
This matrix right here is basically your ultimate cheat sheet. It forces you to map the physical state of your data against the structural layer and the key holder, which creates a deliberate, fully customized architectural blueprint. You look at data in transit, and you check the TLS box. You look at data at rest, and you deliberately decide, do I need the heavy lifting of application layer encryption here, or is transparent database encryption going to suffice? Doing this effectively removes your blind spots.
Notice the stark difference between a high-value target like an e-commerce site and a password manager. The e-commerce site relies heavily on KMS layers for compliance, whereas a password manager shifts the entire responsibility to the user with end-to-end encryption to guarantee zero knowledge. In the e-commerce scenario, the business absolutely has to process the card, so they manage the keys via a secure KMS to satisfy those strict PCI requirements. But the password manager? They literally never want to be able to see your passwords, so they design the architecture so that the decryption happens entirely locally on your browser using your master password. If their database gets hacked, the hackers get nothing but heavily encrypted gibberish.
So, as you look at your own systems today, I want to leave you with this final architectural challenge. Identify your realistic threats, map out your layers, and honestly ask yourself if the friction is truly worth the security. Encryption is never a one-size-fits-all solution, right? It's a calculated, highly strategic layer of defense. So, where are your blind spots right now? And honestly, the biggest question of all, who is holding your keys?